So hi, I'm Chris Butler. I'm the Director of Product Operations at GitHub. The team that I lead mostly focuses on product automation, especially in the way that we end up applying AI to those systems. Previously, I was product operations, or portfolio operations as we call it internally, for the Copilot team at GitHub. And so anything to do with AI inside of GitHub, I was the embedded product operations person that was helping the team be more effective at what they did. But this talk right now is really coming from my experience when I was at Google. And so at Google, I was working in the core machine learning group, which was focused on everything like applied solutions of AI inside of Google to building out frameworks and services like TensorFlow, Keras, anything like that, all the way down to the actual TPUs. And so this team included that entire stack. And my role was to, one, help think about strategy, two, to help with any of the product operations stuff, and then sometimes special projects. But as when Sundar actually started saying AI is our strategy, which I would argue is not really a strategy, but we'll let that go for a moment, we would get a lot of questions from everybody else inside the Google organization about how can I use AI? And this talk is really meant to address the fact that this is the wrong question to ask. And as I can see people nodding already, this has been talked about a lot of times, but I think the problem is that we don't know what is the actual question to ask a lot of the time. Or how do we start to work with teams that are doing highly emergent technologies, that are moving fast, that are changing constantly? How do we actually have better conversations as product managers or non-technical people in the team? Like I would also say designers, I would say product ops people. Even though I have an engineering degree from a very long time ago, I would say I'm not an engineer anymore. And I actually, you know what, I'm not gonna talk about PM's vibe coding right now. It's gonna get me angry. But from there, I think the real key is like, how do we have better conversations between the practices? Within a product like team, we have a lot of different cross-functional practices that are meant to pull in different directions. And so if engineering is there to make sure that something is being built right, it's maintainable, it's something that we actually want to continue to have over time, design is trying to help make sure that these things are usable by the people that are going to use them. And then product management, in my opinion, is not only about wrangling the uncertainty of the world, but also about how do we start to make sure that both the customer or the user's goals are aligning with the business goals that we have. I would also put TPM and program management as maybe risk reduction inside of this whole system. But the point is that each of these different stances or positions are really valuable. And if we end up making everybody be the same, that's really bad for a team. And so inside of the core machine learning group, I started to see a little bit of a trend where we would ask PMs to be more and more technical. And actually in an offsite, I said that PM should not be technical. I then had to retract that statement and say it was my own opinion within the group. But what we start to see within these teams is that we're being asked to be more technical when I don't think we should be. Or we just have more meetings where we're gonna talk more and more about this stuff and eventually we'll all understand what's going on. Or we just start being so heads down into the technology that we leave our customers out of it. And so this anti-pattern I think is starting to show up in a lot of places where we talk about like AI as an emerging technology. And one of the things that I think is really interesting is this is a chapter about something called trading zones, which is really this idea that maybe a long time ago when two different people would meet each other and they'd want to do some type of trade, but they didn't speak the same language, they would actually start to figure out how to communicate so they could transact. And what that would mean is that they would find this space for them to be able to have an exchange of potentially money, of goods, et cetera. This particular paper talks about during the creation of the nuclear bomb, how that there were people like theoretical physicists, there were bomb makers, there were people that were doing instrumentation, and none of them spoke the same language when it came to their sciences and their practices. And so what they had to find was a way to talk to each other in a way that made sense so they could then achieve their objective. It's a little bit of a dark origin for this type of thing, but I swear it's mostly about the idea of how do many different practices that are speaking many different languages. And in some ways, a pidgin, if people are not familiar, is really this idea of like kind of not really a full language, but it's something that we start to use to be able to just at least get some basic concept across. And then creoles end up being languages that are wholly created on their own to be that intermediary for the people that are constantly existing inside that trading zone. And so I think all of the work that I end up doing inside this, and what we're going to be talking about here, there's a little bit of an interactive workshop thing that's going to happen. You won't have to stand up, though, I promise. Is really how do we start to have those conversations that create that intermediary language between people that are potentially working on, very far future AI type of stuff, and then the people that are worried about all the other aspects of the business. So that's the goal of this talk. And I want to start with satellites. So satellites, in this particular case, there was a group that was out of Carnegie Mellon University that was working with NASA because they wanted to help create a satellite that was going to be a big, basically solar sail. Are people familiar with what a solar sail look like? I mean, it's a very wide object. It's meant to catch a lot of the energy that's coming out of the sun. And the problem is, though, is that you have to get into space, and you can't launch this thing fully, pulled out. It's something in the range of hundreds of feet potentially across. And so what they started to do is they started to think about what are all the other ways that we could think about this problem that would allow us to find a better solution than what we might be able to just come up by just brute forcing the problem with the engineers. And so what they looked at were what were some of the non-surface level characteristics of these wind sails and the problem that we're trying to solve. And so one, when we talk about shooting things into space, weight is very costly, right? We're talking thousands of dollars per kilogram, basically. There's lots of space, so things are shaking around all the time. The thing that we're actually talking about is very large, and rockets are not that large, basically. It is nearly two-dimensional, which is interesting, right? And then it needs to fit into a cylindrical object at some point during the launching process and then turn into that very flat two-dimensional thing, okay? So by diving into these characteristics, we can start to think about the problem differently. And this is where analogies come in. And so the analogies they started to think of was DNA, right? DNA is something that's like a very twisted object that if you really extend it, it's very big. Protein folding is another one. Japanese joinery, which is this idea of how do you pull things together in a way that can then also come apart without glue or nails or things like that. And then finally, as you may have suspected, origami. And what they did was they brought in an origami expert to then advise the team in NASA to think about the problem differently. And so now this is a prototype. I don't think this is launched yet, but they are building it in such a way that it's something that when it gets out into outer space, it will be able to unfold based on the principles that come out of origami. And so analogy is a really powerful thing. I think this is one tool, and I'll talk about a bunch of others after we go through this, but analogy is one of these things that helps people talk across different types of practices because analogy is very powerful for human beings. And Melanie Mitchell has a really interesting paper that she wrote a while ago. She's one of the OGs in kind of not only complexity science, and she's at the Santa Fe Institute right now, but also in a lot around machine learning. And so in this paper, it was really trying to teach computers how to understand analogy. But in this particular case, I'm just using it for the definition. So it's really about this idea, right, that there's a perception that two or more non-identical objects or situations as being the same at some abstract level. So in that idea, when we talked about the non-surface level characteristics, that's what we're really trying to go for, is what's the analogy between these things. And analogy is really powerful, like I said. It helps us do meaning making. All of our brains are geared for stories, for narratives, for being able to find that this thing is like that other thing. And if you go into things like practices like naturalistic decision making, it's really about this idea about how we create what are called experience prototypes that we can then match against to be able to discern information from noise in a very particular situation. So meaning making is really important. Narrative, as I said, is very important. And then I would say it's very human for us to use analogies. A lot of the terminology we have is all about analogy to something else, usually spatial things, actually, which is even more interesting. But that's really human. And now all the people that really love first principles, and they're really going to hate this rest of this conversation, but I would argue that first principles are good when we don't need to do that type of meaning making, when we don't need to have an intermediary conversation, when we just are talking about the specs or the specifics about something. But when we need to actually have that conversation across a lot of other people, analogies are one of the most effective ways to do this. So with that, when I was at Google, I started coming up, after reading a very particular paper, I started to think about how we might use this to answer that question of how can I use AI? And what we came up with was something called analogous innovation mapping. But this paper that really sparked my interest, it was about this idea of trying to take both kind of AI-generated analogy as well as crowd-sourced analogy, and then using those things to be able to then create new concepts for a particular problem. And so what they used is a very specific kind of system. So what they did is they would look at a problem, like design a kindergarten chair. They would then, what they call an abstract schema, but it's really the below surface level characteristics of the problem to identify all of those. And then once we have those characteristics, we understand maybe which are the ones that are most important for this particular problem to be solved. We can then use those characteristics to look at the space of other domains and say, these are other domains that have analogous ways of solving these problems. And then from there, we can use those analogous domains to then create new solutions in some way. And so it can happen where you have a problem and you need to find a technology solution. It can also go the other way. And so for a lot of teams inside of Google, they're building brand new things. There's a lot of research and development groups that are constantly coming up with new technologies, but it's like a hammer looking for a nail in everything. What this allows you to do in the reverse is also understand what are the analogous domains that this solution could be used in. So I think of it as like a bi-directional type of process. Now, yeah, and I think the key thing here is that it goes beyond surface level, right? When we work inside of cross-functional teams, we get so caught up in just like doing the very specific thing that is implemented for that particular user, when what we're really trying to find is a conceptual space that will then solve the human problem in some way. So in addition to that, I think there's an interesting thing that comes out of this paper, which is the difference between mechanisms and purpose. So mechanisms are actually these things by which the system works. So we can find analogies within, like, for example, that the particular materials that might be analogous in this world, or the particular types of user experience patterns. Those are mechanisms in some way. But then purposes are these more broad implications of what is actually the goal of this type of solution in some way. So with that, maybe giving you an example now. So analogical innovation for models is something that I think is a really good introduction to the way to do this. So if people are familiar with like model cards or system cards or anything like that? Okay. So model cards were created by a research group within Google to try to explain more about the model than just performance characteristics. And so it's trying to help you understand what type of data was used to train it. Like, why was this model created in the first place? What are the uses for it? What are not the uses for it? Things like that. And what I want to now do is I want to show you, so Gemma is like a very small model that was created by Google, mostly for, basically the idea of doing kind of text analysis and things like that, or text to text. What's interesting is once you start to look at this model card, you can actually start to pull out some of these mechanisms and purposes, which I'll talk about. So some of the mechanisms here are things like it's open source, it's lightweight, which means small, text to text, decoder only. It's not really, I think it's so funny we started calling things small, large language models. I don't understand why we're doing that. But anyways, it's this idea that it will generate more text based on input text. It is trained on a lot of different data sets, so it's not specific to one in particular. And then finally, there is a lot of filtering. So there's a lot of responsible AI filters that are also applied to this. So these are mechanisms, and they're helpful in some way to be able to understand if another system could utilize it. But it's actually the purposes that are probably more interesting. So from that perspective, it is designed for a bunch of text tasks, but they're more for kind of generalization, things like summarization, maybe a little bit of reasoning. And then I think the other aspect is because the purpose was to be open source, that means that it can be deployed like on-prem or on-device somewhere, essentially. So there's also this idea of anti-purposes. And I usually like to ask the question of what is this not supposed to be used for? But if you read through this model card, what you can start to see is that this idea of kind of like low latency applications, it's not appropriate for this type of model. If you want to put in things like PII, not appropriate for this model. Anything that is like domain specific, like it has to be for this particular way of doing things, it's not good. Autonomous decision making, because this is a small model, it's not going to be as good as others. And then finally, anything that's outside of like general text generation and things like that. So now we can take all of these things and we can start to say, where might this actually be useful? And so analogous domains could be like customer service, educational tools, maybe software development, translation services, and marketing. And then something I always like to do is actually even ask, like, what are the analogous domains but weirder? Because I think we start to get into interesting spaces there. Interactive fiction, the idea of like dream analysis, astrology and horoscopes, and esoteric knowledge generation. So All this is meant to say is that we just kind of went from something that was incredibly technical in the way that we're trying to understand it. We started to open up what are the possibilities for this tool in some way. So with that, I want to do a little bit of an interactive workshop with everybody here. What we're going to do is we're actually going to go through the analogous innovation mapping workshop, but here all together, okay? The way we end up doing this, this is something you can do with your own teams when you want to have these types of conversations, is we're going to talk about a problem and maybe some solutions that are taking place. We will start to ideate some characteristics. We will then decide what are maybe the most important characteristics. And we don't have to do that here, but just for like the sake of doing this, we want to prioritize the characteristics so we can make sure we're like honing in on things. And then we're going to ideate a bunch of other analogous domains, problem solutions that might be helpful. And then we'll discuss and reflect. Okay, is everybody ready to do that? All right. So first, I want to introduce a problem to all of you that you hopefully will be familiar with in some way. So I think the problem, especially for autonomous vehicles, is this idea of how do we help pedestrians, bicyclists, and other drivers know what the AV is doing, and I mean autonomous vehicle, to avoid confusion. So this is a problem that we're dealing with here in San Francisco streets every day. And there's lots of different ways to deal with it. There's some that have already been done by, like, say, Waymo or Zoox or whatever else. But I think we can do better when it comes to the solutions around this. So this is the problem. Any questions about the problem before we move on? Yeah, what's up?
Can you give one example of a situation you feel needed this?
Yeah, I mean, there was a really interesting kind of multi-hour presentation by Cruise a couple years ago. I think it was mostly like a recruiting video, but they were talking an awful lot about, well, yeah, when it's too bad if those people went to go work for Cruise. But what was really interesting is it was talking about how AVs are actually dealing with a high uncertainty problem. They're actually modeling uncertainty in the sense that someone could, like, the chance of a child running out from between these two cars, what is that chance right now? Or there's a bicyclist that's ahead of me. What is the chance that bicyclist continues to go straight versus left or right? And so part of that problem is that not all the time do people know what the car is doing either, right? Because we always try to coordinate when it comes to other drivers, other pedestrians, et cetera. And so that's maybe the type of problem I'm talking about. Is that?
But how is that different from a non-autonomous vehicle?
Yeah.
Crazy drivers.
Well, I would ask, would you say that based on the number of deaths per year in automotive accidents that we do a good job at that?
No.
Okay, so it's maybe license. Yeah, you want.
But compared to autonomous, they have zero.
They have. Well, yeah. We can talk about the numbers later. But yeah, you wanted to add something?
Yeah. Well, an example of that is you're crossing the street, someone's coming up on the sidewalk really high.
Yeah.
So you might slow down and look for eye contact. So that's a signal that you're getting that there's something going on.
Totally fair. Or maybe your turn signal, right? Is maybe another really basic example, right? Yeah. Any other thoughts? Does that make sense? Oh, yeah.
An example of last week,
Mm-hmm.
I was on the cross street and then I had the green light for me
Yeah.
as a pedestrian.
Yeah.
Cross.
Yeah.
And there is an AV that nobody would do that, a driver. When it's green for me, the AV just turned real fast before I start, because on my first step, it crossed and it turned.
Okay.
It turned.
So it didn't even. Yeah.
So yes, I want, this problem
Yeah.
is very relevant.
That's totally fair.
I didn't know what he was doing.
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah. Exactly. Cool. Does that make sense to everybody? Cool. All right. All right. So now that we understand the problem, right? There's some solutions that are probably already in your mind already. What we want to now do is we want to ideate some characteristics. So I'll give everybody just a minute to think about what are the below surface characteristics of this problem. So actually, you know what? Why don't you just turn very quickly to your person next to you, and why don't you just chat about it for about a minute or two, okay? We'll make this more interactive so you can meet someone else too. There we go. So what are some of the most interesting characteristics that you came up with that are not surface level, right? Not just about cars necessarily. What else? Yeah, please.
We're just talking about signals, like
okay.
signals that are coming in. You have both sight, sound, and a lot of these things are even electronic. So
Yeah,
you
okay.
have some sound
Yep.
signals coming in that would help you make these decisions.
Yeah, totally. I mean, like the idea of how you send signals between things is very interesting. Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
Maybe it's related, but it's a human body language. So when when people driving,
Yeah.
we can see the driver's eyes, so we are more able to understand
Yeah.
what he's thinking.
Yeah.
But AV, we can't see it, so we're a bit.
So like body language, things that are maybe not necessarily overt when it comes to language. I'll send you a study by someone at Stanford where people don't even notice who's in the driver's seat a lot of the time, but I'll send that to you later. Yeah.
But we do notice when people are not in it.
Yeah. Well,
It breaks us out of
yeah.
the whole routine.
So maybe just like a quick thing about this study. Wendy Ju, who is now at Cornell, she was doing a lot of research with like puppetry and Wizard of Oz stuff for robotics. And so one of the things she created was a car where a person would wear a thing that looked like a seat. And but it had like a little high hole, and they would drive around Stanford campus and then stop at an intersection, then see when someone would try to cross the street, whether they made eye contact or not. And a lot of the time, they would walk away, and then they would ask the person like, "Oh yeah, how did that crossing go for you? Did you notice anything interesting?" And they're like, "No, it just seemed like a regular car to me." And so all I'd say is it's maybe less than we think it is, but yes. Sorry, yeah, you were going to say something.
So I think that one of the subsurface is
Yes.
You don't know how little the pedestrian trusts the vehicle.
trust.
Yeah. So low trust situation potentially.
Sometimes people might trust it a lot, sometimes people
Yeah.
might not trust it at all. So.
Okay. Yeah, low trust situations. We won't jump right to blockchain yet, but okay. Yeah. Yeah.
We thought another aspect might be like the timing of it.
Yeah.
Just like if someone like falls over on one of these scooters and it is going to break right away, right? It's probably useless to communicate that because it happens in like a blink of an eye, right?
So interesting. So like we're more worried about intervention in some cases than even signaling potentially.
Yeah, and when you're like communicating to these pedestrians, it has to be within a certain time frame where the communication gets through to.
So maybe we're even talking about like domains where communication needs to be absorbed, right, and understood more than just signaled. Yeah, that's great.
So consistency, so although there's a lot of some people make a full stop at the stop sign, some people roll through, some people just blow it. And presumably the Waymo will treat the stop sign the same way all the time. Maybe.
Well, so that's fair. So what's the below surface characteristic of that? Is it consistency? Yeah, that's fair. So how do we, what are the kind of the general norms that are at play here? Where are there places where there's strong and weak norms potentially? Yeah. Back there.
This is a many-to-many situation.
Yeah.
It's not just the
Oh, yeah.
car or the pedestrian.
Yeah.
Everything is interacting.
That's right. So what are other places that have highly complex systems that are dealing with lots of different agents in it in some way? You had one, I think, right? Or sorry. Yeah.
I was just going to say also to play on associations, right?
Yeah.
So we know that green means go, yellow means slow down,
Yeah.
red means stop.
Yeah.
So to play on what we already know as a language, that's sort of a language, right?
Yeah,
Because we
that's right.
associate red with stop. So maybe
Yeah.
take
that's great.
advantage of that.
Yeah, so again, I think it gets close to what we're talking about as far as norms and stuff like that, but it is also, to your point, kind of common symbols that are well understood. And fast, yeah, that's right. Oh, yeah, so
You pick up on it
That's right.
faster than maybe
That's right.
some signal that you are listening to.
things that make us highly reactive. Yeah, that kind of maybe subvert our thinking and get us to react instinctually. Yeah, fight or flight, that's great. Yeah, you? Oh, no? Who's next? I think you had your, oh yeah, there you
We
go.
had one around acknowledgement, so some sort of bi-directional.
Great, so like a handshake of understanding, basically, of some type. Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, you had one?
I was going to play on the norms part, in different parts of the world, sometimes
Oh, yeah.
you just walk, the cars will not hit you if you just walk up to them.
Totally.
And then when people started driving, the car companies did a whole big campaign around jaywalking and making fun of pedestrians that jumped onto the road. They did a little social conditioning to put the burden back on.
Interesting. So yeah, it almost feels like there's broader, where are there times that there's broader cultural things? I think it gets to norms a tiny bit too, but yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me.
Some planning for contingencies. People make mistakes, mechanical failures can happen.
Yeah.
Signals can go. Infrastructure is not available, so we need to plan
Yeah.
Not happy part, but what is the edge pieces we have?
Highly unreliable types of circumstances, basically. Cool. That's great. Thank you, everybody. You did a great job. So now we have a bunch of kind of below surface characteristics about this problem, okay? What we're going to do now is we usually decide what are the most important characteristics. I feel like norms kind of came up a couple different times, cultural understanding, the idea of kind of what are instinctual versus thinking types of issues, a bunch of stuff like that, different types of signaling, the idea of communication that needs to be understood versus not understood. Those are all things that seem to be in this like stew or analogy soup that we're starting to create. So with that, now what I want you to start to do is I want you to start to think about what are actually some analogous domains that deal with norms, that deal with like intelligent handshakes for understanding, the idea of signaling, but also understanding. What are some norms, what are some analogous domains, problems, and solutions that have tried to solve this already? Okay? And now join with your new friends and talk for a minute or two. So how did that feel? What were some things that were analogous to all of those problems we just talked about, or those characteristics that you think are valuable? It was hard? Okay, yeah, that's okay. It can be hard, right? Like to think outside of the box that is your product is very hard, right? It's not your expertise. Yeah.
We thought a bit about, maybe just the end there, about like air traffic control. So
Oh, yeah.
where you're like, has anyone seen me as a resource?
That's right.
constraint?
That's right.
But then you think about like transponders and
That's right.
things like that.
That's absolutely right. Air traffic control.
Maybe public pools with no lanes, like people
Oh.
swimming the same swimming pool.
Yeah.
I also think of meeting booths where there's no booking system, where I'm going to use the.
So like, yeah, the use of public spaces somewhere, basically. Yeah, that's really cool. What else?
We were thinking about, I don't know if it's appropriate, that a blind person has the stick
Yeah.
when they walk.
Huh.
It's for them, but also it shows that
They are sight
blind
impaired in
person
some
with
way.
a stick or something that is sight impaired.
Yeah, that's great. What else? Yeah.
It used to be that our norm was to shake hands,
Hmm.
but now through the pandemic, we fist bump.
Okay. So you want people to like punch the AV when they're
Saying, as an analogy,
Yeah.
knowing which to use these days is
Ah.
critical. And so, because there are changing norms, these norms are changing.
Yeah.
It's difficult to know which one's the right one.
Well, and what's interesting about that is not to get too far down that path with like solutions yet, but sometimes these are actual cultural problems rather than technological solutions, right? And so I think that's a really interesting thing to bring up. Yeah, what else?
Yeah, I think mine is more of this is obviously more of a cultural thing as well. We were talking about like dating, like
Okay.
navigating the dating world and like inferring signals without, sometimes they're not explicitly said.
Yeah.
And it's different for different cultures, and it's not dissolved yet.
No. I mean, I hope that type of thing is not solved for a very long time, but I mean, you made me starting to think about cars blushing for some reason, but also, yeah. What else?
Two other analogous domains are like navigating your shopping cart through Costco on a busy weekend.
Yeah,
Or-
that's a complex system, absolutely.
Right? Or if you've ever been to a country where they don't have a lot of cars yet, most
Yeah.
people are riding bicycles, there's a constant ding, 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 ding with the bicycle.
Interesting. Yeah,
Right?
very much.
Using it like sonar.
Yeah, exactly. What else?
We talked about two where it's like a cross-cultural similarities and then also it gives directions. So the first is the doorbell. So I ring the doorbell, I'm expecting a response on both sides. There's some
That's right.
trigger.
That's right.
And then the second was the fire alarm.
Huh?
If you hear that here, we all know exactly what to do. And it triggers a response.
Yeah. I mean, you just made me think of a horrible situation where rather than a like low humming sound, it's just like fire alarms for electric vehicles. Anything else?
I was thinking just languages too, right? How, if someone doesn't understand the language, you're in a different country, how do you navigate when other
Yeah.
people don't understand each other, or like even communicating with
Yeah.
your pet?
Well, yeah,
How does
and-
your pet know that you're, like,
That's
how do
amazing.
you know?
Yeah, we
Yeah.
talked about dog
Or
training.
babies,
Yeah.
How do you communicate with a baby? You
Yeah.
know, so.
That's great. That's really great.
I thought about something.
Yeah, what's that?
That when it's dark,
Mhm.
we wear jackets
Like
to
glowing.
be visible.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah.
So maybe it's not only for the darkness, but the visibility
Yeah.
of wearing something.
Like a disco ball on top of a whale or something like that. Yeah.
Or whatever. They have something.
Cool. That's really cool.
But something that can work not only in the dark,
Yeah.
but also during the day
Yep.
and help communicate
Yeah.
the intention
Yeah,
of
that's great.
movement.
That's
or
right.
whatever.
Yeah. So you all did a really great job. Give yourselves a round of applause, okay? So because I actually do a lot of work with AI stuff, I did create a custom GPT to do this for us. And one of the first answers was air traffic control. So there you go. But some of the other ones that maybe you didn't think of, and I think this kind of shows how, as just product managers, we get so enveloped by our domains that it's hard to see outside of. And this is a muscle that we should be continuing to train. So one of them was actually animal signaling in nature, like the waggle dance. Musical conductors and orchestra doing that. It is. Okay, I will give you that. I will give you that. Let's see, subway and train station announcements, sports referees and umpires. And then my favorite prompt, if it's not giving me interesting things, I always say just like get weirder. And it says bioluminescent deep sea creatures, what do you think is close to your thing? Silent film and mime performance. Bee swarms and pheromone trails. You can imagine like maybe the vehicle smell of gas is actually not being there anymore is a bad thing in some way. The idea of octopus camouflage and mood changes. Haunted house mechanics. Whale song and echolocation. Anyways, all I'm saying is like rave culture and LED flow arts. Okay, I just think we get too like bogged down in the things that we're thinking about that we can't actually pull from across domains into the work that we end up doing. And so this exercise is meant to help you with that. Now it's a muscle that you need to build over time. And I think you all did a really great job. I just think there were slightly more ideas that the custom GPT came up with. But with that, I would like for us to discuss like what is all of these things that we just talked about, how might you actually change the way, like if you were the PM for the AV, right? What might this make you change about what you're doing as far as research, as far as like trying to collect data or evidence, being able to understand your problem better? Maybe any ideas that come out of it?
You discard everything you've heard and just go back to your original solution.
And that is definitely one way to do it, yes.
I think like field trip, just get out in the world and look for analogies
that's cool.
in everyday life.
That's right. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, I was just about to pretty much say the same thing. Just better go outside of your regular domain and explore things which are unknown to you.
That's right.
They probably put it out the water.
Yeah, exploration of other domains is really interesting. I think I tend to focus an awful lot on like qualitative user research in the work I do. And more than anything, like because I usually go there to try to learn about one thing in particular, you end up learning an awful lot about other things too. And so that's why I also think that product managers should be doing a lot of this kind of thing.
Yes. Biomimetics as well, given like several million years of evolution.
Yeah, anything when it comes to like, what is it? It's called exaptation or something. There's a term like that too, that totally biomimetic type of things. How can we learn from all that type of stuff? Yeah.
Understanding what the baseline is now, and then taking one of these domains and trying to see how could you transform from the baseline to what those domains are doing. So
That's right.
with air traffic control, there's two parties and a source of truth.
That's right.
So that doesn't exist in our baseline right now.
That's right.
It's kind of with signals, but
well, and that's like, when you look at something like vehicle-to-vehicle communication networks is what they're trying to solve with that, but like not every pedestrian is going to wear a tag to make sure. I mean, maybe they would if like the cars are really murderous. They would start to do that. But no, I think like you're absolutely right. And even just the idea of saying like, if this is like the way we expect things to be, what would happen if we like prototype this in a different way? And so I will talk about a technique that I think is really interesting for even prototyping that type of new domain stuff. So yeah.
I have a fun idea that was not business.
That's okay. Yeah, go for it.
In the way that Google Maps uses your phones to figure out what the density and traffic patterns
Yep.
are, you could do that to try to figure out where there are high density pedestrian areas and react accordingly. So like when
That's
you're
right.
with your crowd versus.
That's right. And actually, there's lots of great data in San Francisco about where people are hit, right? And so there was a startup I was advising for a little bit where they were thinking about the idea. This was like after I'd worked at Waze. Like it was like, what is the next thing for pedestrians and bicyclists? And it was this idea that you're not going to have a heads-up display like you would in Waze for something, but you might listen to things. And so the idea of getting notifications over whatever else you're doing that says, this is a really dangerous intersection. You should like slow down and understand what's going on right now is a very interesting thing. And there is data for that already today. So yeah.
I think I'll go back to like human-centric idea. So like in the end, we are going to use it. So like we are the humans, like natural like five senses will be the core of everything.
I think you're right.
Product. So
Yeah, and I think, I mean, there's another type of exploration you could do there, right? Is like if you just look at each one of the senses that humans have, right? You could start to then say, like, where are there cases where there's dangerous situations that they're actually warned by each one of these senses in some way? And you could start to pull from that type of thing. So even just like breaking it up in that way could be really valuable, right? Because I absolutely agree with you. Like when we start to think about like patterns for the way that we use things, it always has to be based on just interactivity in general. That's why human-computer interface or human-computer interaction is all about just like, which of these things are we actually doing? It's not always about like, anyways, there's also this whole concept of like somatic design, which is like full body understanding of design. And so I think there could be an interesting workshop you could do around that. If you were actually doing this, you could split it up and say, ideate each one of the different senses, right? So anything, any others? Yeah.
I was just going to say what's interesting is also that you have to allow for how human behavior is evolving, right? So
Yeah.
I'm thinking of Waymo, for instance, and I'm thinking Waymo needs to be way smarter than us because if we're to rely on, let's say, sight and sound,
Yeah.
which is normal
Yeah.
from previous, now people are wearing headphones. I wear headphones
Yeah.
when I'm walking around
Yeah, that's
listening to music. People are looking at their phones, so we're not as alert to visual
That's
cues
right.
or audio cues anymore.
That's
So
right.
if it were to rely just on that, we'd be, screwed.
Yeah, you just made me think about the anti-riot type of stuff that causes the really deep frequency things and putting that on cars to warn people in intersections. No, but that's right. That's right. Well, and I think there's something interesting here because we're not actually talking about some of the other technical reasons why autonomous vehicles might be safer, right? Like they're never distracted, right? Yeah, they don't get tired. They have the fastest reaction time possible. And so there's other things that it has going for it, but you're absolutely right that there's kind of this, as things change.
Has transferred to the Waymo. Like,
That's
I
right.
think people trust it a lot. They will walk
Yeah.
right in front of it and, like.
That's right. Yeah. So thank you, everybody. You did a really great job. Oh, you wanted to add one more thing?
Some more general questions.
Yeah.
I'm curious to know if you use a specific prompt to find analogies like the one.
Yeah, I'm happy to share. You mean like for like a GPT or something like that? Or do you mean a general prompt?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I'm happy to share. Actually, I didn't put it, there's a QR code at the end for all the resources here. If you remind me though, through that web form, I will share my like analogous innovation custom GPT with you so you can try it out, okay? So now, with that, oops, I keep on hitting this. I think like I wanted to give you one pattern that you could experience, right? But there's a lot of other patterns that I think are pretty effective when it comes to talking about these types of things. So one of them is something that I created like probably in 2018, I would guess, called empathy mapping for the machine. And so this is really taking like empathy mapping that comes from like Cooper and a bunch of other kind of design thinking type of practices and turns it into something where if we start to define the desired behaviors of AI as if it was another human being, we can then have a conversation much easier because it's no longer about like the AI doing X and Y, but it's about like what do we expect from this system in some way. And so in the case that I used to do it, it would be like, what does it do? What does it sense? What is it? Oh my gosh, I'm totally blanking. Oh, what does it say? What does it think? And what does it feel? And by asking this question about the system that you're trying to build, and that could be starting from a problem that you're trying to solve, if you had the perfect system that would do this and it was like another human being, what would all these things be? And the does is like what actions does it take in the world? Senses are what are the information streams that it's trying to pull in? The says is like how is it communicating state, errors, things like that. Thinking is more like what are the guardrails or the regulatory kind of things that it needs to be held within. And then feels are really about, if we talk about how do we make sure that it's actually achieving the right end goal. And so this is a conversation that I used to have with people that were highly non-technical around these like prototyping of things that would utilize AI. The next one is confusion mapping. This is more trying to make it easier to understand the kind of standard confusion matrix, which is used in statistics and machine learning. But what's most interesting is actually the difference between like a false negative and a false positive can be very bad or just not that bad. So like in AVs, if I have a false negative that there's someone in front of the car and I slam on the brakes, that's annoying, right? But if it's, that's a false positive. If it's a false negative, if there is a person in front of the car and I don't stop, that causes someone bodily injury, right? And so those are two very different things. The value of like what is good or bad when it comes to errors is like all over the place. And so being able to then have a conversation that says like, what is the worst case that if we think it's right, but it's wrong, what does that mean, right? And again, in very human language. One that's one of my favorites is actually role play. And so where I first started doing this is at Facebook Reality Labs, where I worked on the Portal device. And so the Portal device is like a video calling device, RIP. But one of the things we were doing is we were integrating voice assistants, and actually Facebook's own voice assistant. And one of the things that would start to happen with these systems, because they were sitting on like a kitchen counter, is that one person would ask one thing, another person would ask another thing, and it would be confusing about which thing it should actually do at that point. And very specifically, when I would ask for it to do something, and then my son would ask it to do something else, and then we would argue about it, it would not work out very well. And so what we did is we could have spun up like a bunch of tech people to like start to build something that could understand different voices and start to isolate them and do all that type of stuff. But what we did is we actually just got a couple people. One person played the person that was the originator, the original person asking for something, the other person that was the person that was interrupting, and then the other person pretended to be the device. And we role played different scenarios that would have happened in there. And after a while, we kind of just found out that like there was really no way that that device would ever know what the norms were that were at play. And so we just went with last utterance, which is what we were going to do anyways. And so we found that by exploring this space in a very, very low-cost way, it was the cost of an hour-long meeting for 5 people. We were able to avoid humongous amounts of technical kind of work, essentially. And so that was what I was talking about when we talk about like role play. I bring this up because in one of the courses that I taught on Maven around AI product design patterns, we would use this where it's a AV and a person, and how do you actually then go about your day as that person? And the person has to adhere to certain things, like they have tasks they need to get done in the day, and the AV has to obey certain types of regulations and rules. And so how do those two things work together? And we just use like a play mat in like Figma or FigJam or something like that. And there's a lot of things that you start to then throw in there as well, like what are the wrenches that you can throw into the whole process? So like you just went to go pick up your child at the school, but now that child suddenly needs to go to the bathroom really urgently. Like, how does the AV deal with that? Like, what are the appropriate ways to actually understand how to pause the ride or get out of the ride or something like that? So I think role play is incredibly effective for this type of thing. Animistic design mapping, this is kind of a weirder thing. One of the things I did at South by Southwest in 2022, I did a workshop where we basically create like Dungeons and Dragons character sheets for different devices in a home. And one of the things we would write down is like, what does this device, what makes it happy, what makes it sad, what makes it scared, what makes it angry, what makes it disgusted. And it was titled basically, how does the Roomba really feel about dog shit? That was the name of the workshop. And what we then did is everybody got into a space that was kind of mapped out like a room. So this is combo like role play thing. But we started to understand like, what is a Roomba actually like? Like if we imagine and personify a Roomba and what that spirit might be like what is it like? What is it not like? Same thing with like a lamp. And so a lamp is maybe even easier to understand because if you walk into a room, you don't want a lamp to say, hello, do you want to turn on the light or something like that? Like you just want it to be able to act like a lamp, which is turn on and off the light, maybe adjust the like how much brightness there is, like color, things like that, maybe flash if there's a notification, but you don't want it to talk to you. So animistic design is really just about this concept, and it comes from a person at Art Center, Philip Van Allen, who's now at Delft. But like, how do we start to like assign enough human characteristics to really build mental models inside of our heads on how we should interact with these things? Design fiction, this is a really interesting one for me. This is more of a speculative practice. So it's the idea that I create an artifact from the future and I bring it back to today, and then I don't explain it very much. And so in this particular case, this is a box of cereal, right? It looks like it's just a normal one. There's like some type of cartoonish cricket on it. But if you read it a little bit closer, it says that it's made with 100% cricket flour. There's a whole thing here about scanning to be able to confirm that it's Monsanto official. And so what this says, right, about the world is that things like bug protein is much more like okay in that world. And so are the values that we have today that are maybe bringing us into this future, are they still kind of in line with what we're thinking here? And maybe a better example is like, they did this in Minority Report, right? A lot of different times. And so Minority Report, like the cereal box that plays the little video and audio, and then he shakes it, he can't get it to stop, so he like throws it across the room. That is a world where technology is so prevalent that it is disposable, right? And so is that a good thing or a bad thing? And that's what these types of things are meant to do when it comes to having these discussions. Moral imaginations, and I'm sorry I'm giving you a lot, but I swear I have lots of references here. Moral imaginations is a team that's based in Google again. They help teams start to actually think ethically and morally about the decisions they make within a product team. And the way that they do this is they actually do this through speculative fiction and role play. And so one of them, this is my version of one for like the class I taught, but this is a press release about how someone that was going to a probation, or they were on probation, they had to get to their work, but DriveMo, an autonomous vehicle company, knew that they were on probation, and they knew that their probation meant that they could not go within 500 feet of the school. So they had to take an alternate route, which has got them late to work, and then they went back into jail. And so this is a very interesting question about data privacy, about like what do we do to notify people about what's going on with our technology. And what happens after these people read this press release is they then break into three groups, one which is like the DMV, one which is a congressional committee, and then, a journalist, DMV, and then basically like DriveMo, the company. And so then they argue about this problem together. And so through that argument, you start to really understand like what are the values we're trying to espouse as an organization, and how do we now practice those decisions in our day-to-day life. And so I think this is really exciting. And then finally, incident testing. People are familiar with chaos engineering, this idea that like you assume something will go wrong, so you kind of like practice it. And so I think one of the things that when we talk about like AI is, what happens if suddenly your chatbot promises someone a refund when that's not actually the policy, right? You should probably pretend test that and see how you might react to it in some way. And so, I guess like I keep on thinking about all the things I do inside of GitHub are really about how do we aid the cross-functional product team to be able to make better, faster decisions. And so I guess I wonder, there's some interesting experiments we've been starting to do about how does actually, in some way, the use of these types of large language models help increase the ability to have better conversations. And so some of those things are things like low-risk feedback. So we have a system that will take an initiative and then give some of the most rude, sarcastic critique of that initiative possible. And people actually don't think it's that bad. Like, they love it. They think it's funny because it's actually the things that no one else is telling them right at that moment. Or the idea of like identification of disagreement. We can start to identify that if there's two different positions that are inside of the organization, these two different work streams are really like against each other in some ways. We can start to do that analysis across the org in certain ways. And then finally, bridging across silos, the ability for, kind of like if you've ever used Stack Overflow, you can start typing an issue and it says, here's the other things that are like this. We can start to now create better dependency or better conversations across teams that are maybe very separated by the way that their organizational structures are. And then maybe last but not least, I do think there's something very interesting in the way that we start to apply agents to this. And so we just announced basically like a software agent that you can start to send things to. It needs to focus on very particular types of tasks right now. But I think there's this idea of mob programming. And if people are not familiar with mob programming, it's kind of like if there's pair programming, it's an n of 2. Mob programming is this idea of an n of like 5 or 6 or 7. And they all sit around a screen while the driver does all the work. And then all these different people are maybe like subject matter experts, they're other developers. You can imagine there would be product managers, designers that are all there kind of thinking about the problem. But what if we start to say that like this is the kickoff meeting for our new project, right? The new kickoff meeting is about what conversations do we need to identify and have right now? What types of trade-offs do we need to start to think about? And then even the idea of how do we now start to automatically prototype things and then alter that over time so that we can have very effective communications. And maybe that's all based on the idea of an agent helping orchestrate some of those things. Now, human beings are really good at sensing other human beings, but there's also informational needs that things like Copilot can probably address. So I think the future of this type of stuff is really exciting, is what I would say. So in closing, please don't ask how can I use AI anymore. It's just like, let's stop asking that question and instead start to focus on how we have better conversations between these like highly technical people and non-technical people. So thank you. And if you go to this QR code, it is a form, but you don't have to fill it out if you don't want to. It's just to get feedback on this talk. There's a bunch of links to like the slides and a couple other things. So yeah. Yeah, it's also that bit.ly URL down there. So yeah, thank you. I'm happy to take questions too if we have time. Or yeah. Questions, thoughts, disagreements? I'm happy to argue with anybody. Yeah, go ahead.
Your very last slide reminded me of music production.
Oh,
where
yeah.
4 people have a music workstation. They're all plugged into one mixer, so they're all working on the same mixer, same
yeah.
time. They're all doing their bit, and then they can bring their bit up and contribute
That's right.
to the whole thing that everyone's participating.
Yeah, I mean, software and services development is not as team-oriented as we'd like to think it is, right? Like, to your point, a band playing together plus the sound engineers, there's a lot of like interaction that's taking place. So I think in the future of this type of thing, we need to build better ways to do collaboration. A lot of the tools...
And that's software-based, so those people are software-based.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Exactly. And so I think that's the thing, is like, I think a lot of the effort right now is going into like coordination work, right, which is really, really important too. But we don't think as much about like what are the structures we need to be able to collaborate better. And so I think that's like a future. Yeah.
Just curious, you've done this, it looks like you've done this across a couple different companies.
Yeah.
How do you think about who needs to be present in the room and then who should not be present for best opportunities?
Yeah, that's interesting. I do think that the more viewpoints, the better. So like in the analogous innovation, for example, it is important to have kind of a bunch of different perspectives rather than like all engineers, for example. Like you don't want to have an overweighing of that type of thing. I think in the analogous innovation, one of the things we would do inside of Google as well is we would bring one of our like what they call Uber technical leads, which is like a very senior, very, very technically knowledgeable person to sit and listen to the first like hour or two of the meeting. And they wouldn't be involved in like doing anything until the end where they would say, hey, actually, if you are picking these different analogies as the thing that you want to try to like solve, here's the way that this has been solved with these software products. So it's like, so one of the teams was like, they basically, the analogy that they came to that was most interesting was actually like a Netflix recommender service analogy. And so in that case, there's a very specific type of technical stack that can get you there. And so they would then be able to offer that. Yeah. But I think actually like there is something to be said for some of these like empathy mapping for the machine, some of the other things where it's kind of earlier phase. It's really good to have the customer themselves in those meetings versus the other ones where we're starting to like wrestle with how we're going to solve this problem. That ends up just being the cross-functional team, maybe with team experts or something. It's what? Yeah.
To crash all of their executive classes.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. Cool. Yeah.
Actually, I was just going to continue on to what you started to explain there with like the analytic design, the future design.
Yeah.
Are these all things that you do within a cross-functional product team? Do you bring customers into these?
Yeah.
Do you bring stakeholders in? Can you just like slow down and tell us like what's the setting for all of these?
Yeah, I mean, so the problem with some of these practices is that they seem a bit too like woo-woo for people. Like one of the things I have like a bunch of decks of cards in my backpack. Like I will do people's product team readings in tarot cards sometimes. And I think an awful lot about like randomness as like a decision-making tool. And so, a lot of people, like one of my old VPs of product used to say like, oh yeah, I want you to do one of those like, you know, cutesy, too smart workshops that you end up doing all the time. So I would just say like there is an appetite for this type of thing, but if you end up going too weird, you like overheat the thing, you lose trust in a lot of these teams. So I would say like for teams that are really in like the cutting edge and experimental type of area, they tend to be much more open to these types of things. I would say that some of these though do require a certain amount of kind of practice to get good at. So like design fiction, for example, something I really love. The problem is that a lot of people start like diving down into like the UX of an app rather than thinking about this artifact that exists that's like the manual for the app or the warning on the box of the app or something like that. And so those are tools to help like push the idea of like what is the future rather than we're going to design the future right now. And so that's what I'd say is like I think I use these piecemeal whenever I think it's appropriate, especially like empathy mapping for the machine. That's a great first exercise to do where you're just like, we kind of know what the problem is. We don't know all of the different space that we need to worry about right now. And that one is not that bad. Like people kind of get what we're trying to go for, right? Animistic design mapping, you start to get into like weird role play situations. Like it's just, I would just say like it depends on the team, right? I think it's bad though that like we're not able to do this type of like experimentation with the way we collaborate. But honestly, in companies that have a lot of smart people, usually engineering-driven organizations, they tend to be very certain about things. And that certainty is bad in some ways, right? It doesn't allow us to open our minds to other ways of thinking, other domains, that type of thing. But it does help deliver sometimes. So that's what I would say. Is like you got to kind of gauge it. And this is I'm trying to give you a menu, I guess, is what I'm saying. Yeah. Is that fair? Yeah. What else? Yeah.
So what caught my interest was you mentioning about AI as a tool that you could embrace to facilitate the conversation.
Yeah.
Especially around being able to provide some, off-the-wall, like, critiques or something that facilitates the conversation. I've heard similar comments from recent CPO summit that I attended.
Oh, cool.
So I'm interested in, like, hearing any success stories that you had, like, in using AI to use, like, facilitate conversations and something that you found.
I would say that, like, right now, it's not necessarily inside of conversation. I mean, it's more like I will pull up something in the middle of a conversation. I'll say, like, within this like thing, like, what are some other options that we could talk about? What we don't have quite so much yet is the idea of like a agent joining our Slack channel to. I mean, they're there, but they're like bots. They're like IRC bots, if people remember that type of stuff. Like, it's like very still. It's not always helpful, right? And you don't know when to trigger them. They don't know when to step in. And so I would just say like the times that I've seen like the most success with them though. So far has been in basically this project we have internally where you enter an initiative and then there's a bunch of different commenters that start commenting that are all from different viewpoints. And one of those viewpoints is rude Q&A, but another one is like, how in alignment with our current strategy is this? Where are there gaps that are here? What would a famous strategist say about this? What's an oblique strategy card that you could pull for this? And so all of that stuff ends up helping people. It's critiquing the PM's thinking in that particular case. So I think that's the thing is right now that's where I've seen the success is that idea of like critiquing. And this has helped. I mean, the other part of this project is it then auto-generates a bunch of like documentation and tries to maintain it. And so they've seen huge time savings in that. And then the critique of your stuff is actually opening and broadening your perspective about the initiative in some way. So that's where I've seen success so far for that type of thing.